Hello, everyone. This is the Vice President of Internet Infidels, Edward Tahmizian. You all know me from my published paper on the origin of evil and theistic hard determinism that's been making waves. John W. Loftus really likes it, and Jeff Lauder reposted it too and really likes it as well. And today, I'm going to be interviewing the one and only great and legendary Prince of the Christ myth theorist, Dr. Robert M. Price. And if Carrier's the king, then he's definitely the prince of the Christ myth theorist, along with David Fitzgerald, who I guess is the duke, and then I guess we got Raphael Lataster as the princess. Sounds about right. Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty much the four big ones when it comes to, the mythicist movement. Everyone knows about them. And I've done reviews with Dr. Robin M. Price about 5 or 6 times. And today we're going to be talking about very good questions. And I'm sure our audience, as well as Dr. Robin M. Price, will appreciate them. So going off of our first question, so Richard Carrier on his official blog wrote that Robin Faith Walsh, quote, suggests that the Gospels might not have been even authored by Christians, but just that they are literary exercises of playful auteurs. This is Robin Faith Walsh, her opinion. She doesn't insist on this. She merely states that if you wish to maintain these authors were Christians in advocating a position, perhaps even a position they believe their community shares or that they want it to share, you need to present evidence for that, not just presume it, which is fair enough. One should be able to present evidence to believe in that. And I have a little bit of a segment. It's a little long, but this is, the only long question I have. And so Carrier responds with, I'm certain we have. The gospel designs are thoroughly propagandistic and thus only make sense coming from an interested party intent on controlling or advising the behaviors and doctrines of the faithful. And their knowledge of Christian theology, organizing principles, and all the Jewish scriptures and apocrypha undergirding it all does not seem likely to be the product of idle pastime. Mark builds his entire story to sell the Christian mission out of the epistles of Paul, for example, and he goes on to say that, Matthew in turn is quite intent to defend the Torah-observant Christian faction against Mark's design, and Luke to unify and harmonize those warring factions, and John to blow up the whole affair with wholesale religious reform. These are obviously concerned missionaries, not idle auteurs. So, I'll ask you, Robert, do you agree with Robin Faith Walsh that they were just, auteurs that were just incorporating, mythicism into their writings, like imitating, Virgil's Aeneid or Euripides' The Bacchae? Or do you think, like Carrier, that they were concerned missionaries?
I think Richard's right about that one. And I agree with virtually everything in that quote. In fact, it reminds me of my big objection to my pal Joe Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, where he has some really interesting observations about the gospel texts and Josephus and so on, but his really tangential theory that this was written as either a kind of an intelligence test or for readers, can you tell this is a parody, or that it is well, the same thing, that it's a joke on them because snicker, snicker, the poor dopes don't realize I'm talking about Titus. That's really unnecessary and far out, but it doesn't really matter. That's not the main point. And I think that, but the objection I have is that who would do that? I mean, if you were doing something like that, it would sound like some of the the Jewish anti-gospels that told it of Yeshu, though the best known of those don't really sound like their anti-Christian slander, despite the fact that they're supposed to be. So they don't read that way to me. That doesn't mean they weren't. It's possible that Robin Lane Walsh is right, and I understand this. She's just making a speculative suggestion. This is not her theory, really, but I think you do have evidence to show that it's really so far-fetched to suggest that. Now, where I think she is right, she parallels the late great Old Testament scholar Philip R. Davies, who is talking about the Old Testament, but he later in life said that this probably applies to the New as well. He said, who wrote these books, the various Old Testament books, and for whom? Who was their intended readership? And he said, look at the, who had books to read back then, and who would have picked up on subtle redactional changes. Like if you compare Chronicles with Samuel and Kings, it's a kind of slanted, tendentious rewrite. Who would be interested in that? I mean, the patterns are there. You can see redactional trends. What this tells you is that people couldn't just go into their bookstore and grab a copy of the scriptures off the shelf as they can in our day. No, it was an educated elite, and I don't mean that as a cuss word. I know people like to, elites, but there were, an upper crust who had the leisure, like Joseph Pieper, the great Catholic philosopher, said in his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. You're just not going to have scholarship and philosophy and all that kind of thing except among the leisured class. And however they got that way, whether they were fair to their workers, that's a different issue. But the fact is, yes, that must have been the case. The Old Testament books were written by and for scribes, like the people mentioned in the Gospels, who copied scripture for the few people that could read it, and they were the experts in it since they were the only ones familiar with it. It's the same, I think, in the case of the New Testament. If you look at the works of redaction critics like Willy Marxen, especially Hans Conzelmann, Gunter Bornkamm, and others, they managed to show by a magnifying glass scrutiny of the Gospels, comparing them one with the other, Luke with his predecessor Mark, Matthew with Mark, and so on. It's hard to miss a pattern in each of editorial changes, and you can figure out what they're getting at. It becomes pretty clear that Luke is trying to tamp down people's apocalyptic expectation or comfort them because their disappointment in the failure of the second coming has shook them up. And so you can tell this without much difficulty. So but does the common reader see this? And I don't mean stupid people. I just mean non-professionals, non-scholars. They appreciate what they read. More power to them. They're edified and guided by what they read. Amen to that. But you can't expect them to be consulmen. And so there's a level on which these things cannot have been written just for the average Joe. And she's saying that. It looks as if they're the work of literati of some kind. Yeah, that's what Davies was saying. And what kind of literati? Well, not just your local writers group. No, they had to be religious and theologically trained people in the ancient world. And so they were. So I agree with her that they're literary products, but I agree with Richard that they have to be promoting their own ideas. And when the Gospel of John says, now Jesus did many other things like this, but you'd never be able to have big enough shelves to hold all the books, but I have recorded these so you can come to the same faith I have in Christ and have eternal life. Who would even write that if it's just a kind of an exercise? Now, she is in effect, I know this is more than you wanted to hear, but she is in effect saying that the Gospels are like Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana, which is a long, picaresque novel with many, many similarities to the Gospels. Apollonius is a kind of a counter Jesus, though I think independently. It was a Neo-Pythagorean work. But Philostratus was not necessarily a believer in Apollonius. He was commissioned by the empress, who was a fan of Apollonius, to write up a hagiography, lionizing the guy. Well, that's about as close as I can come. It could be that somebody said, hey, I don't have the skills to do this. Like Paul supposedly used an amanuensis, a kind of a ghost writing editor for his epistles sometimes, and that a lot of people did. And it's like, look, so-and-so, Secundus, Timothy, whatever, here's what I'd like to say to the Thessalonians. I want to make these points. Can you write it up for me? Like somebody might have done that with the Gospels, like Philostratus did with the life of Apollonius, but that's as close as I would come, just as idle exercises in writing, like as if you're writing a science fiction novel. Oh, like, let me just mention this and I'll shut up. I was a big fan of the Dune books and of the David Lynch version, the movie version. Well, once I wrote to the estate of the great Frank Herbert and said, I'm not the only fan out there who is intrigued by your quotes from the Orange Catholic Bible and stuff like that. I've written pseudo-scriptural fictional stuff. I'd like a crack at writing the Orange Catholic Bible. What about it? And they said, no, we don't want to start a cult. And I didn't say it, but I should have said, I got news for you, pal. You already did. And I'm just allowing us both to make some bucks off it. Now, that's kind of what people that have done pastiches of Lovecraft's Necronomicon just for kicks, that would be kind of like it. But it's very difficult for me to read the Gospels and all this, either the theologically polemical material in them or the edifying ethical material, and think that this is all some kind of a prank or a fiction. Could be, but it just seems unlikely. Of course, ultimately it does not matter because the text speaks for itself. It could have, like the Gospel of John could have been written by a room full of monkeys typing randomly on typewriters, and it somehow came out this way. Who cares? Doesn't matter. Maybe it was written by Martians. Who cares? It's the content that matters. So just to put the importance of it in context. So I'm making a bigger deal out of it than Ms. or Dr. Walsh would, I'm sure. But I just consider this from different angles, and I'm trying to give as much credit as I can for how plausible I think her theory is in what respect. But ultimately, my punchline is what Richard says, that it'd never look like this if that were the case.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like the Richard Dawkins reference. That was cool. And secondly, yeah, going off of what you were saying, like, Dennis mentioned like the woman with the alabaster box and how that's like a clear recontextualization of one of the pagan works. Forgot which one it was.
Yeah,
but it's
me
like,
too. I know
like
what
how
you
many,
mean.
yeah, like how many people are going to be reading that and being like, oh, this is similar to, what's in like the Epic of Homer or, the Odyssey. Like who's gonna pick up on that? Because like not many people could, read or write that well. And even going off of like, just like hearing things without like reading it, like how many people would pick up on those references? Because it's like not everyone's as clear as even Derek Lambert admitted, like, the woman with the alabaster box is like the clearest example of mimesis you can find. But like with the rest of them, it's like a lot of people aren't going to be able to pick up on them. So it's like, what's the point of them like utilizing mimesis if like not that many people are going to pick up on what they're doing? It's like,
Well, I would speak up on behalf of that, in that Dennis is assuming that this is written for people who will appreciate the mimesis, that they'll have echoes of the Odyssey, which was popularly known.
oh
Whether
yeah.
people had actually read it or not, a whole lot of people, you can tell from other writings, did know this and would have found that to be a kind of a soundboard against which the Odyssey and the Iliad would have echoed and gotten depth for them. But again, who's going to appreciate all of it? You wouldn't really have to. It could just be that things people liked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, the mimetic writers figured, well, they're going to like here too, and they no doubt did. So I would find uh, what Davies pointed out, the literary character, that does apply, but I think a larger audience would have appreciated this. Like popular philosophies, like the Stoics, made a big deal out of Odysseus as an example of self-sufficiency and so forth. And when Paul comes out as kind of another Odysseus in many ways, they said, yeah, that's the kind of hero. Or Jews, Hellenistic Jews said Jacob, he was a wily, resourceful SOB. I like him. And was that based on Odysseus? It could well have been. That stuff was a lot more recent than we thought. So I think he may have a point, and Walsh's view is not really opposed to that. She's just kind of confining it to an elite. I think she, in a way, goes a little too far, and her view is basically compatible with Dennis's, I think.
Yeah, all righty. Sounds like a fair analysis. All
By
righty,
the way, let me
moving
just
in.
say I feel free to refer to Dennis by name because I do know him. But I'm not personally acquainted with Professor Walsh, so I don't presume. But that's my
Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And Carrier likes to talk shit about everyone. Like he did it with me. He did it with our president, John McDonald. He was like John McDonald's bizarre take on the penal substitutionary atonement model of the cross. He wrote a big blog on that, and he kind of went against Dennis. But as we talked about, like that was kind of fair because it's like Dennis like really didn't like he kept on calling. Remember when he was interviewing me and he kept on calling like Carrier's myth, Christ myth position like a conspiracy theory and said that like Carrier's like a desperate hobo going into the dumpster trying to salvage whatever he can like but he didn't really defend his position that well like he didn't the only time he adequately did that was with the Jewish polemic because I mentioned that he's like oh why would the Jews who were enemies against Christianity admit that an empty tomb if there was no empty tomb. Why did they say like, oh hey, yeah, Christians, there's an empty tomb, but it's because the disciples stole the body. It's not because he rose from the dead. Like, why would they admit that? And Carrier kind of like goes into like how that's a problem. Like with he believes that the empty tomb legend was so late that like the Christians could get away with anything.
Yeah, in
So
fact, Charles Talbert, back in 1977, in a book called What is a Gospel, was already making the case that Dennis and various other scholars nowadays, like M. David Litwa, make with a truckload more evidence that can't find the body stories were multiple, plentiful, and that alone would have said that the hero had ascended to heaven one way or another. So I think that Dennis is perhaps, though he wrote a book similarly about how mythical Jesus has become, but so mythicized. My question for him would be, do you believe there was a historical Odysseus? Must there have been one of those? I mean, are you going to strip away? I could be like King Nestor, who's mentioned in the Iliad. There's some evidence archaeological that he existed. I mean, there could have been one, but is there really any reason when the whole thing is knit from miracle stories like the Cyclops and Circe and the Wind God and all this stuff? It seems to me you better have some kind of decent case for Odysseus. I mean, it's another one like the Gospels. I don't see why it's immune. Now,
yeah,
however, again, I don't want to get into the arguments because I have the greatest respect for Dennis McDonald's work. It inspired my New Testament dissertation, and I just think he is great. Though he sort of doesn't like me anymore because I'm a Trump supporter and he's a card-carrying cop. Now I don't care because I got friends who are communists from way back. It doesn't matter to me. But he doesn't like my political smell. But I don't care. He's great anyhow.
yeah. Yep, I've done a lot of interviews with Dennis. He's a nice guy. I mean,
Oh
he's
yeah.
got like conflicting opinions. He'll be as nice about it as possible, except for that one time he ripped into me. Well, it happens. Alrighty, going into our second question. Do you like Carrier believe that the early Christians thought that Jesus was crucified by sky demons in the nether realms? Why or why not?
Well, I do favor that theory. Now, I admit you can, in the state of the evidence, it'd be impossible to prove it's true. And there is at least one other theory, the Brandon Eisler theory that Jesus was a revolutionary. And though, in a sense, they could both be true because if you believe Jesus was originally a celestial mythical being and was eventually historicized to meet polemical needs, to say against the Gnostics who said, oh yeah, Jesus told us this in a vision. And the Catholic Church, Irenaeus and those guys were saying, look, that's uncontrollable. You're just playing, can you top this with a new revelation every week? Why is there any reason to believe in any of that? No, we have a founder we have the copyright on the real Jesus. Well, they may have borrowed some actual historical Jesus. And the reason I think that's not merely a kind of tactic of desperation is there is this intriguing but very ambiguous statement in Paul where it says there are people preaching another Jesus. Now, what the heck is that supposed to mean? Well, it could easily mean that there were two different. Jesus is a common name, very common, and
Yeah,
that
true.
somebody had melded the two together. And somebody had said, oh, the celestial Jesus, he did come to earth, and it was that guy. Remember him? Oh, I mean, that could have happened. Who knows? But that's why I give not quite equal weight to both of those theories. But basically, I think Richard is right. The business in First Corinthians that the archons put Jesus to death, sealing their own fate because they didn't know who he was, and in Colossians that the principalities and powers engineered his death. That sounds very not what? No Romans, no Sanhedrin, no Pilate. What? That seems and statements like those Romans, they never persecute the righteous. It's always the way. Don't you believe Pontius Pilate crucified Jesus? I don't know if you'd say that if that's what you thought. So, I mean, there are reasons to think that these early guys believed in a celestial Jesus, and even the idea that he was crucified in the heavens. Look at the book of Revelation, where you have bloodshed and wars in heaven, where the Lamb who was slain is in heaven on a throne, and stuff like that. There's weird stuff, or statements in Revelation and in First Peter that Jesus was slain before the foundation of the world. What? Well, there is a natural setting for stuff like this. It's mainstream, if you can call it that, Gnosticism, where they believe that the evil archons, the fallen angels, had to steal sparks of spiritual light from the heavens to animate the mud pie creatures they had created. And where'd they get them? Well, from the primal man, the man of light, the Christ Ion, as he was called variously. And this gave life to the world. Their sacrifice, their murder of him. And eventually, he returned to the world to regather the stolen sparks. Well, right there, you've got enough of a celestial mugging and dismemberment of a Christ figure in heaven before there were any human beings. And it gave life to the world. That, to me, is not simply a kind of wacky, slapped together myth that never really appears anywhere. It sure does. Just read Gnostic texts. So I take that very seriously. Some of his arguments, Richard's arguments, I don't buy, but they're not serious. They're not daggers in the heart of that theory.
Mm-hmm. All
Like the
righty.
heavenly sperm bank thing. I don't buy
Yeah.
that, but it's unnecessary. He's
Yeah.
only forced into that because he believes in the Pauline authorship of all of those epistles, whereas I think their later works filled with interpolations.
Okay. All right. Interesting and very fitting that you mentioned Revelations because my next question is, what do you think of the Book of Revelations? What date would you ascribe to it? And who do you think wrote it? And what was their precise intention?
Well, it seems to me the theory that holds up best with the least problems, in my opinion, is the traditional one that comes from Irenaeus, who said it was written late in the first century in the time of the Emperor Domitian, and because he was apparently a persecutor. The evidence is unclear on that, but people seem to think he was or would be, which is, by the way, what Revelation says. The beast will shortly persecute the church. It doesn't say he did. It fits in with current Roman myths, such as that Nero, though assassinated by his own guards, his mortal wound would heal and he would become not only the seventh Caesar, but the 10th, because he would return one day. And they believed that several people claimed to be the returned Nero. Well, people thought that Domitian was the returned Nero. And 666 totals up in the usage of the day to Neron Caesar, Nero Caesar. There are a couple of other possibilities, but it makes so much sense. Plus the locusts from the bottomless pit that cross the river Euphrates, and the way they're described, it's pretty clear they're supposed to be Parthian cavalry. And the belief about the revived Nero was that he would take revenge on Rome for getting rid of him by leading a Parthian invasion into Rome and destroying the harlot that sits on the seven hills, Rome. And it makes a whole lot of sense that way. Now, there are other views. There's some reason to think earlier documents have been included in it, like the little scroll in chapter 11. That sort of appears to have been forced into the context, just like Mark 13, a similar apocalypse. Doesn't seem to belong there originally. It's possible that the 666 did originally refer to Nero, and they didn't realize he was also Domitian. It's hard to say, but there are other wilder theories that say, like that of, I believe it's Josephine Massingberd Ford, who believed that I think that John the Baptist wrote the basic draft of Revelation, and that the Virgin Mary is somehow involved because of the woman clothed with the sun. And this is more speculative than I want to get, but I take all these things seriously. Or Margaret Barker, another genius. She thinks that it's all about the events leading up to 70 AD, and that the beast is, I guess, Vespasian and or Titus, and that the false prophet is Josephus, the propaganda master. That's pretty interesting. So, I don't know, but to me, the one that seems most plausible is the traditional one that would place it in between 90 and 100. Just one more little item. Some mythicists have, like I think Gordon Rylance, long ago, about a century ago, argued that this is the earliest book of the New Testament. And the reason for that, and again, this is pretty interesting. He says Jesus, there's a reference to his crucifixion, but it's in chapter 11, the little scroll, which might be an interpolation. Without that, what do we read about the nativity of Jesus? That the woman clothed with the sun gave birth to him, and a dragon tried to devour him. This is the birth story of Zeus, and that the child born would rule the nations with a rod of iron, like Zeus, and so on. And that there are other references. Hades is personified, so that it may have owed a big debt to Greek mythology. Now, another one, a great book by his name is, oh boy, I'm losing it. I'll think of it in a second. A guy that's done books about the anthropology of the New Testament, which are quite interesting. Joseph, I think it is Molina. He wrote a book called something like the genre and message of the book of Revelation, where he shows that by far most of the puzzling imagery in Revelation is simply taken from ancient astrology manuals, of which many survive from those days, like the Astronomicon of Manilius, which is the basis for Lovecraft's Necronomicon.
Oh, interesting. All right.
There's a lot of, and just the punchline, I love the book of Revelation, despite what Charlie Manson and Hal Lindsey have done with it. I don't think it predicts the Beatles, which is too bad since I worship the Beatles, but there's a lot of fascinating stuff in it, and it is endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Even though, Revelation says, that the end of times will be coming very soon, and that clearly hasn't happened, other than
Right. Oh,
that,
yeah, it's a false prophecy.
other than that, it's an interesting book.
Yeah.
All righty. All right, going into another interesting question. Dennis loves to reference this too whenever he talks about early Christianity. So I'll ask you, what do you think of the church father Papias's testimony? Do you think, like Dennis R. McDonald, that he knew John the Elder, who was someone born around the late first century who had valuable insights into what authentic Christians believed in?
I don't think we can trust him. It's like if you catch a witness on the stand lying, you're obliged to disregard everything else they say. There's no reason to believe them anymore. They've poisoned their own well. Well,
Mhm.
Papias tells us some plausible things, like who wrote Mark and Matthew and why. But as Strauss pointed out long, long ago, D.F. Strauss, we're not even sure he means what we call Matthew and Mark. There were other works attributed to people named that. And what he says doesn't sound much like our Matthew and Mark. When Papias describes him, he says Matthew was written first and Mark was an abridgment. No, there's no way. It's obvious Matthew has abridged Mark and added loads of other stuff. Oh, but Matthew was an eyewitness. If that's the case, why would he depend on a secondary source like Mark? He corrects Mark all over the place. Why would he do that? And if he thought, oh, Mark, it goes back to Peter, really, so it's unimpeachable. No, he couldn't have thought that. But the one that really kills it is what Papias says about Judas Iscariot. You know how in the book of Acts, they have a little flashback. What the heck happened to Judas? Why are they uh, choosing a replacement, because the Gospel of Luke doesn't say. And
Mhm.
well, it says, well, he bought a field with the blood money he got, and in it, he swelled up and exploded, and his entrails gushed out. Now, Matthew has a whole different thing. They don't say when it was, where it was, but Judas hanged himself, and he didn't buy the field. The Sanhedrin did. They took the money and said, "Well, we can't put this in the temple treasury. It's blood money. It's unholy. Hey, why not buy the potter's field as a cemetery for the indigent?" Okay, and that's why it was called the Field of Blood. But in Acts, it's called the Field of Blood because his blood watered the grass. So Papias has a version of that. And he says that Papias that Judas didn't just explode, he swelled up to grotesque, gargantuan proportions like
Yeah,
a
wagons
balloon.
with. Yeah.
He couldn't squeeze between the buildings on a street corner. And finally, blew up like Mr. Creosote in Monty Python's Meaning of Life. And before that happened, he was in the habit of urinating maggots. Like, what the hell? This guy is to be trusted? I don't care what else he said. If he said, my name is Papias, I wouldn't believe it after that. So I think that is very now what Dennis is getting out of this really is just hints, and that's all we've got about possible gospel sources that didn't make it in as canonical books, and so forth. Maybe he wasn't referring to our Gospel of Matthew and our Gospel of Mark, but something that had something to do with, like many scholars have said, what Papias refers to as Matthew may be the Q document. Well, Dennis is saying something like that, which is speculative but entirely reasonable. And his work on these sources of the Gospels and how to determine who had the earlier version, and how there are, in different Gospels, different ones' versions seem to be more original. Dennis brilliantly manages to dissect all of that to say, well, I see a pattern where Mark had some source, Matthew didn't, and so on and so on. The guy is incredibly brilliant. And so that I'm not convinced, partly because I just am not very familiar with that theory yet. But from what I have seen of it, amazing stuff. He's given a whole generation of people homework to evaluate that.
Oh yeah, and then Papias said something like not only was the Gospel of Matthew first, but that it was originally written in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And D.A. Carson comments that the the Koine Greek, well, something about like one of the works is a non-translatable Greek or something. I don't know if that affects anything with Matthew. I guess maybe he's trying to get on the fact that the gospel, according to Papias' theory, the Gospel of Matthew couldn't have been written into Greek and then translated into Hebrew because he said it's something about non-translatable Greek. So it's like that's interesting that Papias is saying that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. Who
Well,
knows?
George Howard wrote a couple of books about a what survives as a medieval Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. Is not, he argues, it is not a translation into Hebrew for Jewish polemicists to be able to refer to. It was that there were two original versions of the Gospel of Matthew, one in Hebrew, one in Greek, which is what Russell Demirgan says about the Pentateuch. Though one is not a translation of the other, they're two different things put together at the same time by a bilingual group, which makes a lot of sense. And Howard is saying the same thing about the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if that's true, that Papias would still be wrong, but it would be a way of understanding why he was wrong, that it wasn't just a stupid mistake. He didn't have the full story. So that's a possibility. Let's see. Charles Cutler Torrey, another favorite of mine, argued decades ago that all four Gospels were originally written in Aramaic because that was as widespread a lingua franca, I think it is, a second language all over the Mediterranean, dating from the time when the Persian Empire was so important, but that Koine replaced it because of Alexander the Great Hellenizing the whole place. But that that's why the Gospels would have been written in Aramaic, but then translated into Greek. And he has a number of suggestions as to passages that would make more sense if they had originally been written in Aramaic and the Greek translator saw what were actually homonyms in Aramaic and chose the wrong possible meaning. And most of them, I think, are kind of insignificant. One of them that I like, they're very striking, is the anointing thing, where it says that they were in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper. What, may I ask, were they doing in the house of a leper? I mean, you want to steer clear of those guys. You had to as a religious obligation. Or maybe he was just called that as a nickname. Hey, remember the good old days when you were a leper and nobody would speak to you? That seems unlikely. Well, Torrey said, so happens that the same Aramaic word they would had to have used if it had been written in Aramaic to translate here also could mean jar merchant. And what happens in the story? The woman takes an expensive alabaster jar, and she's in the home of a jar merchant. And he wasn't a leper, so you don't have to worry about wearing your COVID mask and all that. So I mean, who knows? But there's something to be said about an embarrassment of riches here. I mean, there are way too many plausible theories to be dogmatic, but most of these guys know that. They're not dogmatic like apologists are. They know that as New Testament scholars, they're historians, and they have to recognize that all theories are provisional and open to revision, open to refutation. So you might have your favorite and want to work on that, but polemicize against other people unless you just think they're saying nonsense. I mean, I've had occasion to do that sometime, but and no doubt people are doing it with mine. No question. Do your worst. That's the name of the game in scholarship. You don't have to be nasty about it.
Gotcha. All righty, sounds good. All righty, and for our last question, seems that the Christians believed that back in the first century, if Jews wanted to kill a suspected false prophet like Jesus, they would need the permission from the Roman authorities and would have to go to the governor of Rome, Pontius Pilate. However, this has been contested by some historians. I mentioned this to Dennis R. McDonald, Rob, and Faith Walsh in my second interview with them, and I also told them that even according to the Gospels, this seems false. For example, what were the Jews going to do if they successfully stoned Jesus to death, as they tried to do several times? Go up to the Roman soldiers and say, "Oops"? It seems like the Jews thought that they had the authority to kill people they did not like, and they did think that they had the jurisdiction over giving capital punishments. Dennis thought that that was a good question, and cited Josephus, where he said that the Pharisees did have authority to give capital punishments. And according to Deuteronomy, false prophets were to be stoned, not crucified. So what's up with the crucifixion narrative?
Well, of course, Deuteronomy presupposes Jewish legal authorities. It doesn't assume that you're a subject people to a Gentile empire yet. So that's a little bit that doesn't exactly figure in neatly. But I'm not, though I realize there is divided information about this. And I think Sherwin White, who wrote Roman law in the New Testament, I believe he says that there's equivocal information evidence on both sides. However, let's assume they didn't have the authority. There really is a consistent picture there without too much squeezing. I mean, I'm against bogus harmonization of Bible contradictions, but I'm not sure this is one of them, because in the Gospel of John, when it says they picked up stones to stone him, but he slipped away and things like that, there are about three of those places.
Yeah.
And the Stephen thing, what they're giving you the impression is that Jesus had goaded the mob to a frenzy and they were a lynch mob, basically. That kind of stuff, no doubt, happens in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that, when technically you probably should bring them to trial, but who bothers? So that doesn't surprise me. That could have happened. Or it also says in most of these instances in John, they decided we better not, because there's a crowd here and they're all his fans. They may lynch us. I mean, they say that explicitly. And so in light of that, they go to Pilate because they don't want to get the blame. They want to be able to say, hey, we didn't harm your boy. It was the Romans. Expect that from them. I mean, it's explicit, actually. So I don't see that much of a problem there. It's almost moot whether they had the authority or not.
Okay, yeah, okay, so you're saying like if they successfully stoned him, that like at that stage of the game they were like they didn't think it was that big of a deal if the Roman authorities like found out they could just, try to, I don't know, give money to Pilate or something, I don't know, to kind of settle the deal. Kind of like with the guard story, like, hey, if the
Exactly.
yeah, if they figure out, what really happened, or
Mm,
that you were, or like, because you're telling the lie that you fell asleep on the job. If Pilate, gets that story,
mm.
we'll try to secure you somehow. But then you're saying like later on, like the Jews were like, okay, well, let's go to the Roman authorities, not so much because we don't think we have the authority to give capital punishments, but to just, say to blame it on the Romans so that,
Mhm.
if his followers, expand and become big, like they won't like go after, the chief priests and scribes, they'll just go to the Gentiles, and of course the Jews hated the Gentiles, so kind of like taking the blame off of them, kind of, at least insofar as
Yeah, and
killing them.
explicitly
That's
says
understandable.
that
All
they
right.
don't want the blame because they said if we killed him or even arrested him in public, we could be the object of mob attack. And let's get around that. And that's why the whole thing with Judas. How can we catch him when there's nobody around? Well, if we can get a man on the inside, and that's why they did that. And so they want to shift the blame to the Romans once they have him. To me, there's no real problem with this. Now, in John, they do say, "Oh, Governor," he says, "Judge him by your own law." I said, "Well, we would, but we can't because of the capital punishment thing." And Pilate goes along with it. Doesn't even say that in the other three Gospels. They just decide to say, "You might want to deal with this guy because he's a revolutionist. Look at this king of the Jews." And, okay. And so if even there, they're just trying to shift the blame. And
Right.
some people will not say this because they say, "Oh, we don't want to be anti-Semitic." Get real. The Sanhedrin, the high priest Caiaphas, Annas, these guys are vilified in the Talmud. They're called the serpents of the house of Annas. They didn't like these bastards either. They put them to the sword the day they started the war against Rome. So it, so I don't. Some people will not have any Jewish involvement, but all I'm saying is the story is putting it that way. How do I know?
Okay. Yeah, gotcha. And then an additional comment, I think you'll find this interesting. Like throughout the Gospels, like you have all these like miracles done to authenticate that, Christ rose from the dead, or that the Christians are backed by God. You'll have like an angel at the tomb, and it's like in the guard story, like why is he sitting on top of the rock and not just going into the tomb immediately? Well, presumably it's because of, like the Jews who were against Christianity walking by there some, I guess, Saturday morning, being like, "What the fuck's that white thing sitting up there?" And they go up, and the angel says, "Oh, hey, I'm an angel by God. I'm here to tell you that the empty tomb's only empty because Christ rose from the dead. Like, if anyone says anything about the gardener, that's all wrong. He rose from the dead." And you have all these proofs, and even in Acts, you have like, the miracle of the healing of the lame man to kind of authenticate the Christian message. So I'm just kind of like, and then you have like the zombie apocalypse in Matthew and all that. So I'm like, if God's like if God allegedly did all these miracles with like the 500, like why didn't he just send the angel to the Sanhedrin during the time of Acts and settle the whole thing? Or why can't Christ just like appear in front of the Sanhedrin? Like that's the way you do it. You don't appear, like believers don't need evidence. Unbelievers need evidence. Because like most of these appearances are to believers, like the 500 Christians, brethren. You give the appearances to unbelievers. So the perfect time, that angel should have just got up off of a tiny, and then 40 days later gone to the Sanhedrin and appeared in front of them during the interrogation in the Acts. And then that way Gamaliel would have been like, okay, they did a healing, and then the angel came. All right, guys, we're gonna have to announce that, make an official announcement that Jesus is the Messiah. And at least that would have ended, even if they didn't like Jesus' teachings and weren't like converted, they at least would have officially acknowledged he's the Messiah, and that would have ended the Jewish persecution of the Christians. So like, why didn't he do all that? And it's like, I'm thinking like, how much if this is legendary, how much the gospel writers would want to invent that the resurrected Jesus appeared in front of the Sanhedrin during, the time frame in Acts. But it's like he couldn't have gotten away with that, because if that happened, that wouldn't explain history, because then the Jews would have had to have acknowledged that Christianity is the one true religion. So yeah, what do you have to say to all that?
Well, that's right. It's that happens another time, for instance, when at the Transfiguration, when they see Moses and Elijah, and we're not even told how they knew that's who they were. They have name tags. Hello, my name is Elijah. Well, the disciples, as they're coming down, say, "Well, why do the scribes say Elijah has to come before the Messiah? And he and Jesus says, well, actually, he did. You just, if you're willing to accept it, that was John the Baptist. Oh, why are they asking this question? It sounds like if he's not coming, where'd the scribes get the idea that he would? It's like what Mark has done is, well, now that I've had Elijah appear on stage, I got a couple of other bits and pieces about the return of Elijah vis-a-vis the Messiah. Let me plug them in here. Topically, they fit, but they don't fit the context, because it implies that when Christians heard this objection from Jews saying, look, your guy may have been great, but where was Elijah? Even if your guy's a prophet, he can't be the Messiah because Elijah's first. And they say, oh, well, actually, you're right, but you're too literalistic. It was John the Baptist. Oh, yeah, right. Okay. And it wouldn't have convinced them. That didn't work. So back to the drawing board. Elijah has to come, not somebody else taking his role. Oh, well, now that you mentioned it, he did, and I got his autograph up there. It's too bad you weren't there. Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, I'll believe that. I would have to have been there, but I wasn't. It's the same sort of thing. Or later, Paul says to one of his interrogators, these things weren't done in a corner. Well, these were. Why doesn't he appear to anybody? Now, there's a book that was once very popular called the Arco volume, Archko. I've never been sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. This guy claimed that he had gotten documents out of the Vatican Library, a whole bunch of them that bore on Jesus. And in one of them, Jesus did appear to the Sanhedrin after his resurrection. Hey, guys, remember me? And so forth. So what you say about the myth-making instinct is right, though this, of course, is many centuries later. But why didn't they at the time? Well, you have a pretty good answer for that, because it would have conflicted too much with other things believed to have happened at the time. But yeah, why does Jesus only appear to people who knew him? That's very suspicious. And apologists say, well, there were a couple of exceptions to that. Paul, for one. Well, wait a minute. There are reasons to believe the whole Pauline conversion thing is a legend, a fictional compilation of the conversion of Heliodorus from 2nd Maccabees chapter 3, and the hypnotic conversion of King Pentheus by Dionysus in Euripides the Bacchae. Both are so similar. Dennis McDonald will agree with that. And so that's not really, that's built on sand, that argument. We don't know what the heck happened with Paul. Now, the other one, James, his brother James. Now, John tells us he scoffed at Jesus, but now he's the head of the Jerusalem church. And it says he appeared, 1 Corinthians 15, to James. Well, that must have done it. No, this is all a harmonization. We got a text that says he thought Jesus was a charlatan and a publicity hound. We got another one where he's the head of the Jerusalem church. We don't know which James is intended in 1 Corinthians 15. And so it's simply a harmonization. And by that, I mean, I'm probably horribly confusing all the listeners with this, but you know how people around on Good Friday say that Jesus began to carry his cross to Golgotha, but he had just had the hell beat out of him, and he didn't have the strength to carry the cross, being plausible. So he dropped it, and then they yanked Simon of Cyrene out of the cross. Hey, you carry this guy's cross. That's plausible, but no gospel says that. All all three of
Good
the
point.
synoptics simply say they got Simon to carry the cross. And John says he carried the cross to Golgotha. And to harmonize it, you say, okay, he started carrying it, but couldn't carry the whole. No gospel says that. The 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. There's no gospel where he gives 7 sayings. They just scotch taped them all together. And these are harmonizations to iron it out. That's the idea of James converting because he repented of his unbelief in his brother. No story says that. The one in the gospel, according to the Hebrews, it says Jesus appeared to him and said, break your fast, my brother, for the Son of Man is risen from them that sleep. It says that James had already taken a vow that he would not eat until his brother rose from the dead. That's not in any canonical gospel, but that implies it's told by somebody who always had believed in Jesus. An opposite tradition, a polemical rival tradition. These things, a lot of these debates are based on a fundamentalist literalism, even if you're an atheist. They haven't gotten deeply enough into the minutia of the text to be able to see this. I'm not criticizing them. It's just that you got a lot of homework to do if you want to say something about this stuff. I would never make any remark about sports. I know absolutely nothing about sports. So you're not going to hear me say, hey, how about that guy who was MVP?
Yeah, gotcha. All righty. Well, those are very good answers to those questions. Thanks again for coming on again. And I guess
Oh,
to
great
close off,
fun.
yeah, I know it was fun. This was a good interview. All righty. And then I guess to close off, did you have any final comments or promotions, exciting activities?
Well, I have various books in the works. I guess my latest books on the Gospels, etc., are The Gospels Behind the Gospels, which has been out for a few months now. And before that, Judaizing Jesus, where I attack liberal scholars. I have one that I've just finished and I'm going to publish myself called The Heresy of Paraphrase, an interpretive rendition of the Gospels, where I'm doing my own version of all 4, like an ancient Targum, one of those paraphrases of Old Testament books that the rabbis did, because the originals were in Hebrew. People didn't know it anymore, so they did a kind of living Bible paraphrase into Aramaic. So they had like a commentary built into the translation. Well, I decided that's what I want to do, to build in what I think is going on by making it more explicit and adding some humor. So I think that's going to be an eye opener to people, the heresy of paraphrase. And also, some months from now, I hope we'll see my massive book on world religions come out. It's called Houses of the Holy, a higher critical study of the world religions.
Nice.
That's over 600 pages. And
Dang.
no matter how many world religions books you've read, you've never read one like this.
Yeah, and I like the Led Zeppelin reference.
I don't really care for them, but I like the title.
Yeah, House is the holy. Yeah. All righty. Well, thanks again, Rob. That was a great interview. And in a couple of minutes, I'll have this downloaded on my YouTube channel and I'll share it with you. You can put it on
Great.
YouTube, do whatever you want with it. All righty. Thanks again, sir.
Well, see you soon.